China continues to apply pressure on Japan. On November 21, 2025, the Chinese embassy in Japan issued a bilingual statement on X, citing the enemy state clauses Articles 53, 77, and 107 of the UN Charter. The statement pointed out that if any of the former fascist or militarist states, Germany, Italy, or Japan take any step toward resuming an aggressive policy, then the founding member states of the United Nations, China, France, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States, are entitled to take direct military action against them without needing authorization from the Security Council. As long as China determines that Japan is taking steps toward renewed aggression, China only needs to notify the UN, and the People's Liberation Army can directly carry out military strikes against Japan. Doing so would not violate the UN Charter, because the enemy state clauses grant these rights to the founding members. The Japanese authorities certainly understand the gravity of China invoking the enemy state clauses, yet they waited 3 days before responding. The response was difficult. Japan cannot deny its identity as a defeated nation, but also does not want to admit the validity of the clauses. On November 23rd, Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs responded on X. On November 21st, the Chinese embassy in Japan released a statement regarding the former enemy state clauses in the UN Charter. As for the old enemy state clauses in the Charter, a 1995 General Assembly resolution acknowledged they were outdated and largely symbolic, and China voted in favor. Furthermore, at the 2005 UN World Summit, the General Assembly adopted a resolution in which all member states agreed to remove references to enemy states from the Charter, and China joined this consensus. Assertions that these expired provisions are still valid do not align with the decisions already made by the United Nations. The cunning Japanese side not only invented the manipulative term former enemy state clauses, but also twisted China's support for the General Assembly's proposal to remove such language into a claim that the enemy state clauses are already invalid. Yet no matter how the ministry argues, even Japanese netizens filled the comments with, "So the enemy state clauses haven't actually been removed." And that is the fact. The enemy state clauses still exist in the UN Charter. Japan wants to remove them, but it cannot even meet the threshold for submitting a draft, let alone succeed in deleting them. Why can't Japan remove them? Removing the enemy state clauses is essentially an amendment to the UN Charter. To amend the Charter, 4 steps are required. A draft amendment must be submitted. The General Assembly must agree to put it to a vote. During the vote, the draft needs approval from 2/3 of all member states. After passing the GA, it must be ratified by the legislatures of member states. None of the 5 permanent members may cast a veto, or the amendment automatically fails. In reality, Japan cannot even accomplish step 1 on that step is merely the entry requirement. If Japan were to submit a draft that solely targets the enemy state clauses, the General Assembly simply would not accept it. The matter would never reach a vote. Charter amendments are part of comprehensive UN reforms, and draft content must be broad in scope. No one amends the Charter for a single clause. In other words, any amendment must be a package involving multiple deletions, additions, or changes. And submitting such a comprehensive draft, a new charter would require decades of negotiations. 30 years may not be enough. 50 years might barely be possible. And reform has always been a Sisyphean task, a multi-generational endeavor with no end in sight. Even supposing Japan miraculously completed the first 3 steps through sheer force, at the last step, a single veto from China would instantly nullify everything. Japan knows that all its efforts would ultimately be in vain, so it has never pushed the matter with full force. Japan's only practical option is to render the enemy state clauses obscure, to make them disappear from public awareness. Therefore, when China brought them back into the spotlight, Japan panicked. The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs also reminded the world that it possesses the Russian language version of the clauses. The US, the UK, and France also have English and French versions. They simply choose not to add pressure on Japan. Thus, Japan's authorities can only argue endlessly, attempting to confuse the issue by claiming the clauses are invalid. What the enemy state clauses fundamentally mean. The existence of the enemy state clauses effectively authorizes the victorious nations to take preemptive action to extinguish the spark before the flames of aggressive war reignite. Put simply, any defeated nation that has truly repented has no reason to fear these clauses. Conversely, Japan's deep anxiety over them is precisely evidence that it harbors ambitions of renewed aggression. As the saying goes, food that is harmless to people can be lethal to dogs. As long as the clauses remain in the charter, Japan will remain afraid, yet it lacks the power to delete them. So it clings to the meaningless argument that the General Assembly's support for removing the language somehow means the clauses are invalid. Meanwhile, in Japan, right-wing governments continue expanding the scope of collective self-defense, hiding aggressive ambitions under the banner of self-defense, until politicians like Sanae Takaichi blatantly reveal their intent to use force against Taiwan and undermine China's reunification. The origin of the enemy state clause's most online explanations begin with the founding of the UN in 1945, but the concept appeared earlier during the planning of the post-war world order. On November 29, 1943, at 2 p.m. during the Tehran Conference, Roosevelt and Stalin held a US-Soviet leaders meeting at the Soviet embassy. They discussed the post-war global order proposed at the October Moscow Conference of Foreign Ministers, namely establishing an international peace institution centered on the US, the Soviet Union, the UK, and China. Roosevelt stressed that any new institution must not become another League of Nations, a debating club with no teeth. He envisioned three bodies: a general organization where big and small nations could speak, later the United Nations; an executive council handling all non-military issues like agriculture, economy, health, etc., a police committee responsible for maintaining world peace. Stalin asked, would the executive council and police committee be independent? Roosevelt said yes. The general body would include dozens of nations, the executive council 10 or 11, the police committee only for the US, the Soviet Union, China, and the UK. Stalin asked, so the police committee is a coercive institution? Roosevelt replied that coercion was essential. He brought up the example of Italy's 1935 invasion of Abyssinia, Ethiopia, where the US urged Britain and France to block the Suez Canal, an action that would have crippled Italy. But Britain and France instead submitted the issue to the League of Nations, resulting in paralysis. Thus, the police committee had to consist of only 4 powers, able to act quickly. Stalin asked, would this require US troops in Europe? Roosevelt said not necessarily if Germany or Italy reappeared as threats. The burden of responding in Europe would fall mainly on the Soviet Union and Britain. Stalin argued that legal restrictions alone could not prevent Germany from rearming. Germany could convert furniture factories to aircraft factories, or watch factories to torpedo part factories. Therefore, to prevent a revival of aggression, strategic positions must remain under Allied control, allowing immediate encirclement and strikes against Germany or Japan if necessary. The US and Soviet views aligned. One must strike first against defeated nations showing signs of renewed aggression. Roosevelt agreed completely. Thus, the function of the police committee was, once a former enemy state shows signs of renewing aggression, it must receive an ultimatum demanding it cease all harmful actions, otherwise it would face bombing or even occupation. This is the origin of the enemy state clause. In short, as long as defeated nations behave, the clause remains dormant. Later, the UN, the Security Council formed by merging the executive and police committees, and related institutions developed further, leading to the final UN Charter. Why police committee became permanent members? Police implies criminals. After the war, Germany, Japan, Italy, and the Axis powers were indeed the criminals or prisoners, before they proved that they had truly repented. Terms that suggested a police versus prisoner relationship were deemed inappropriate for the UN. Thus the name was changed to permanent members. But in reality, Germany and Japan were prisoners. They had to be reformed and kept under supervision. Germany's reform was thorough. Not only can fascist ideology never reappear, even Prussian spirit cannot be invoked. Japan, however, was not properly reformed. The emperor remained, and Yasukuni's shrine remained. This is unimaginable in Germany, who would dare venerate Hitler, Goebbels, or Himmler as martyrs for the nation. Yet Japanese politicians visit Yasukuni every year, showing no trace of repentance. Why was Japan, a prisoner, treated leniently? Because its jailer, the United States, had ulterior motives. Thus Japan's right wing grew increasingly brazen, even portraying itself as a victim. The prisoner even wants to become a police officer by seeking permanent membership on the Security Council. Once politicians like Sanae Takeichi come to power, Japan's criminal genes surface. This gives the enemy state clause an opportunity to reawaken. If militarist Japan resurrects, the clause will resurrect. Since the enemy state clauses came into force on October 24, 1945, they have never been invoked and are regarded as zombie clauses. But once Japanese militarism rises from the dead, the clauses will rise as well. Japan need not skirt around the issue. If Japan likes gambling with its national destiny, it can gamble against our World War III. Then we will see which survives, Japan or the enemy state clauses.